obviously today being Mother's Day, and we've done several of them. And when you think about it in Scripture, there's not a lot of mothers specifically mentioned by name and some of their traits, but I'd like to look at some of them. And it's kind of humbling because obviously I've never been a mom, but I have a great mother, and I have a wife that's been a great mom, and I've witnessed many of you around here. So I like to look at it, just look at some of the characteristics and about great moms. And the first thing I like for us to think about is that of spiritual moms. We're at an age now where I think a lot of us spiritual moms. So if you turn to 2 Timothy, and I'll give you the background. In 2 Timothy Chapter 1, thank you, gentlemen. 2 Timothy Chapter 1, the background of this is in Acts chapter 16 and verse 1, in which on the second missionary journey, Paul wanted to take Timothy, and it said Timothy, whose mother is a Jewish believer, came to know Christ, but his father was Greek and non-believer. So when you stop and think about it, should his mother have even married? No, never should have. But needless to say, you're thinking about it, obviously she did she came to know Christ, accepting him as her Messiah, and does it. But you notice in 2 Timothy chapter 1, notice in verse 5 what it has to say. It says, "For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you," talking to Timothy, "which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure that is in you as well." So notice then on the second missionary journey, the mother comes to know Christ. Obviously the grandmother is a believer, Jewish, and recognized Christ as her Messiah. And Timothy, and notice also it's on display, they can see it. So I think it's interesting how even if you made a decision that might not have been the best, God can still change you. It's a choice you make about who you are with Christ. And notice they taught them. The mothers and the grandmother taught them. And I think a lot of it, when we think about spiritual moms, we see so many of you all are taking care of grandkids and everybody else. You may not be the mom, but you can be the spiritual mom in the home. And I think it's important to recognize, in this case, they were both the actual mom. And obviously without a believing dad, all the spiritual responsibility fell on the mom and the grandmother. So I noticed it can be done. So I think it's interesting. The choice they made was to accept Christ. And then also notice the decision, and also display. When they have true faith, notice it said that we can see it in your grandmother, we can see it in you, your mother, and we can see it in you. Faith is being displayed. I think also, you talking about spiritual moms, there's also a cost involved. Look over in Romans chapter 16 for a moment. A little bit of a background, if you stop and think about it, has Paul ever been to Rome? He never had been to Rome. Why, if Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles, why has Paul not been to the capital of the Gentile world? If you remember, Paul stated earlier that he didn't want to build on a foundation that somebody else had started or building. He was going where people hadn't gone, and people had gone to Rome. But because now obviously he's in Romans 15, he's taken up a collection to bring to the Jewish church, and he picks it up. He's writing from Corinth, so the letter to Romans was written from Corinth, and he's now sending the letter to Rome. And his plan was, if you look in chapter 15, his plan was to take the money to Jerusalem and then go to Rome on to Spain. We know he got to Jerusalem and got arrested and never made it there. That was his plan. So he writes the book of Romans from Corinth. Gives you a little bit of background. Notice in chapter 16 and verse 1. "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church which is at," you notice that's the port of Corinth, the eastern port of Corinth. Notice what it says about her. "You receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, that you help her in whatever manner she may have need of you. For she herself has also been a helper of many, and of myself as well." The word there, helper, on the second one is that of patron, and the first one is that of deacon, where we get the word deacon from. So in Corinth, she is a servant, a spiritual mom to all the people in Corinth. She's now going to Rome. And he's telling the Roman believers to do what? Help her any way she can because of the great spiritual mom she's been. Who do you think carried the letter of Rome to Rome? If she goes from Corinth to Rome, and he writes the letter from Corinth to Rome, who probably carried this letter? Speaks an awful well of this spiritual mom. But notice the cost. She must have had a person of means simply because of the fact to travel in that day. But needless to say, it's interesting you have a spiritual mom. You have the same thing when you look at chapter 16, notice in verse 13. Greet Rufus, a choice man of the Lord, also his mother and mine. If you remember, Rufus was the son of who?
Simon.
There you go. You remember the one who carried the cross. And notice then the change that she had. So here you have Simon here. You stop and you think about it. So she comes to know Christ, and she accepts Christ as her Messiah. And notice that she's a mother. He's a mother to Rufus, but she's also a mother to Paul. Spiritual mom. I don't think a lot of times we don't give credit to so many different women of Scripture and what all the part that they play, that they had in Scripture. So notice you think about these spiritual moms, it's a choice that they make. It's also going to cost them something. But what about some characteristics? Look over in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2. Paul's writing to Thessalonica. And he's speaking about himself and Timothy and Silas. You find that because of chapter 1. Notice what he says in verse 7. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 7. Notice he compares himself to a spiritual mom. This is in verse 7. We proved to be gentle among you as nursing mothers tenderly caring for her children. Notice he says we are gentle and we are tender. And it's amazing how you can see that with moms and everything else. And the baby's screaming and crying and you're wanting to quiet them down, and they can be so patient and kind with them. Notice in verse 8 and 9, having thus a fond affection for you, we were well pleasing to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you have become very dear to us. You recall, our brethren, our labor and hardship, how we worked night and day, so as not to be a burden to you, we proclaim to you the gospel of Christ. Isn't that a mother too? Devoted what? Night and day. Getting up all hours of the night, whether it's feeding or changing or whatever it might be. So you think about it, the spiritual moms, it's a choice that they make. It's a cost, but also they have some great characteristics. You stop and think about it. You have the same thing about a mom, a literal mom, but also what they're supposed to do. Look over in Proverbs 31. Usually you think of Proverbs 31 and you think of the godly woman, but that's the last half of the chapter. You ever read the first part of the chapter? Notice in verse 1, the words of King Lemuel. There's many that believe that is Bathsheba, and that's what she called Solomon. We don't know that for a fact, but Solomon did write the book of Proverbs. The oracles which his mother taught him. So notice, the literal mom, but she's teaching in spiritual truths. Proverbs, you remember earlier in the book, Solomon is teaching truths. Notice here he's saying the mother taught him the truths. It's interesting when you look at what she says in verse 2, what, O my son, and what, O son of my womb, and what, O son of my vows. So she made a vow to do it. If it is Bathsheba, perhaps after with the death of the earlier one, and she made a vow, and she was going to raise the Lord gave her another son, that she was going to raise him correctly. And then you notice from verse 3 down to verse 9, she starts giving some very practical teachings that a son needs. And it's interesting, spiritual teaching from the father, but also spiritual teachings from the mother. And so I think it's interesting when you look at it, Isn't that what we're told in Proverbs 22:6? Train up a child what? What? Notice that's both husband and mother. And notice you have it here, and she's doing it. So let's stop and just think about it. How many of you are thankful for your moms, your wives, or that God's given, or some of these characteristics? How many of you want to share something about your mom or your spiritual mom? Anybody? Yes.
Brian kind of brought this up in Sunday school. I wanted to personally thank Margaret and Greg for getting me back in church, because it did make a huge impact. Without the Sunday school, there's a fear effect when you never know what life you're going to impact. And he pointed out how many lives that impacted just by them getting me back in church. And that's Margaret. Love you guys.
Yes.
I think that Pat Woods was my spiritual mom at work and bringing me here, and I miss her.
Who else? Yes.
I remember my mother for kindness and caring for others and devotion to God. She loved us little church.
Anybody else? Yes.
Well, my mom is with the Lord, and I'm thankful for that. But I'm also thankful for the mom and dad that He's given me. With you, Mom and Dad, because they have been precious to me now for, 45 years this June, but beyond that, because I guess we were dating and engaged before that too. But I couldn't ask for a better mom and dad, and they have been a blessing to me. I'm very thankful, very grateful.
They've been a blessing to all of us.
Amen.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Yes.
Thankful for my mom. She was a hard worker. She had to be. She raised 10 children. But she was a prayer warrior. And my brother didn't have hearing, and they didn't know it, and so he couldn't speak. And so his speech was delayed, and he stuttered, and the kids made fun of him at school. But my mom prayed that he would be able to pray in public. Not only did he pray in public, but he led Sunday school. And a teacher came to his class and he said, "Phil, I never thought that would happen to you."
Who else? Anybody? Yes.
I came from a household with a very controlling and abusive grandmother, and my mother was a peacemaker.
Never easy at times.
I had just the opposite. My mother was very difficult and negative, but my grandmothers thought I was the best thing since sliced bread. They made me feel better. And my grandmother Ruth was and my grandfather Michael was the best example of what a godly couple should be. And they showed me by example and by sharing the word. So it was inevitable I was going to know God, because they made sure of it. She was the go-between, and made me feel loved and cared for all the time.
Bob?
Okay, this one, 14 days after an accident on Christmas Day, unknowing the outcome of whatever number of surgeries we were faced with, and able or not to maybe have a leg, we don't know, was more concerned about her children, I guess our children, having Christmas on Christmas Day than she was about her own leg. And we had to have a video. She had to organize it all with my son, set up all this camera stuff, so live from room 1022 in St. John's Hospital. It's Christmas morning with the forensics. So we had to watch the kids. So she put herself, her child, grandchildren, way above her own self.
That's what
I think it was the medication. But she got all the good pills. They wouldn't give me any.
That's what moms do. Anybody else?
Perfect example.
Yes.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about my grandmother, my father's mother. Her name was Malicha, which she was born in the Netherlands, and Margie's named after her. And my dad was born a year after she immigrated. She was always taught, like I was when I was young, that you couldn't know that you were saved. And I remember one time when they had house visitation, the elders said, "Mrs. Hartog, how is it with your soul?" And that was a standard question. And she said, "Well, I hope I'm all right." And that was the end of the conversation. And I thought about that. I thought, she's so good and so gentle, and she reads the Bibles. If anybody should go to heaven, it should be her. And that put something in my mind, so that when I heard on the Back to the Bible broadcast that you can know that you're saved, that's when I was saved. And it's so important to me to have right doctrine, because it affects every area of your life. If you don't know you're saved, how can you tell anybody else?
Exactly.
So I'm thankful for my grandma.
Anybody else? All right, let's think of what about a mother who doesn't have all the answers? You ever been that way? Every day? Okay, look over in 1 Samuel chapter 1.
First what?
1 Samuel chapter 1. What you have, you notice in verse 2, you have a man who has two wives. We don't know which one he took first. That's just for the sake, let's say he took Hannah first, and she didn't have children, and so he took a second one, and notice they have a number of children. You notice that in verse 4. He had sons and he had daughters with the other one. So they've been this way for a long time, many years. So you think about it with Hannah, it's been a problem for a long time. And obviously, her husband loved her, and it could very well be he married her first, loved her the most, but he wanted children, offspring, so he married another. Not right, shouldn't have done it, and obviously great tension in the home. And you notice then she obviously rubs it in verse 6. And every time she would go to, year after year, she would go to the temple and it'd be rubbed in and he would bother her. So notice then she starts to pray, and it's interesting, when she starts to pray in verse 10, she makes a vow. Think about it, verse 11. She made a vow to the Lord, O Lord, host, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy maidservant, and remember me, and not forget thy maidservant, I'll give thy maidservant a son, and I'll give him to the Lord all the days of his lives, and a razor shall not come upon his head. So she's going to give him in service and also the Nazarite vow. And you stop in verse 2, then 12, then down to 14. Eli, the priest, sees her lips moving, but no words coming out, and he thinks she's drunk. Well, can you pray silently to the Lord? And how many times when you and I how many times you ever watch people and they're thinking in their own mind, their lips are moving, but nothing's coming out? Well, okay, so he sees it. Notice then in verse 15, Hannah says, No, my Lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I poured out my soul before the Lord. Don't consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken unto now of my own concern and provocation. And Eli answered and said, Go in peace, may the Lord of Israel grant your petition that you've asked him. Notice in 16, how many times is just, year after year this has been going on? And obviously she made the request here. She said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way, ate, and her face was no longer sad. Has her circumstances changed? Outwardly, no. But she's turned it over to the Lord, she's laying. So I think it's interesting, when you don't have all the answers, as that's true for all of us, how of us are taking it to the Lord. And I think what happens is so often, it's a tendency, I think, for most husbands and most guys, how many times are we trying to solve all the issues? A lot of times they need a listening ear, or it's God's place. It's not for you and I to try to solve it all, because we're not God. And we can be supportive, but we are not the answer. So I think it's interesting. She prays. But notice when you get to verse 24, the price, the child is born. Now can you imagine, you've been wanting this child for all these years. You get the child, but what did you promise? How easy would that be to do? After you've raised him, and it's been for this first couple of years, and all of a sudden you've had him, and now the weaning time is over, and you're now going to stay true to your word, or you're going to say, "Wait, I'm really attached. I'm not going to do it." It's amazing. She's a woman of her word, and she does, and she gives it to him, and she brings it. She reminds Eli of it. This is who I prayed for, and she then gives it to him. So not only does she keep her word, the price, but it's amazing. You get chapter 2, the great song she writes. Now, how of you have been prayed for this the whole time? God gives you what you've asked for, and now you're going to give it away. And you're going to exalt the Lord for it. Now, she doesn't know she's going to get more children. God does grant her that, but she doesn't know that. It's amazing, though, just the mother that you... And obviously, when you see how Samuel turned out versus how Eli's sons turned out, totally different. But it's amazing when you look at it. But you notice, she has a problem, she takes it to the Lord. Only He can answer it. Only He can solve the problem. And notice she turns it over to Him. Her face changes, countenance changes. But then she keeps her word when it is come true. And I think it's important for us to recognize the praise that she has. But notice it's interesting also, the provision in verse 19. Every year when they come up for the sacrifice, what does she do? She provides clothing for him to wear. So every year she's going and she's doing what she can to provide the clothing for him so that he can do it. And he grows up, and obviously she then in verse 21, the Lord allowed her then to have 3 sons and 2 daughters afterward. She didn't know that when she asked and prayed the Lord for a son, but God granted it. I want you to think about it. How many of us have issues that only God can solve? How many times when all else fails, then what? Why don't we go to the Lord first? Would it have been better had Sarah done that, which instead of taking matters in her own hands? We have a lot of problems even today, don't we? Because of it. A lot of times we try to do it. And guys, we shouldn't always try to step in and fix things when it's the Lord's job. And then also, how well are we about keeping our promise or our word? I mean, she did. She made a vow, and it cost her dearly. But she made sure she stayed true. And she did her very best to provide for him. What about a change of plans? I think with a lot of you had change of plans. Marilyn's already talked about change of plans. How many of you have change of plans when you ought to be in retirement, but you're raising grandkids or you're doing other things? Change of plans. You stop and you think about it. What about in Luke chapter 1? And you know the story well, and we've been through it many times, and you hear it every year. You think about it with Mary. Mary was betrothed to be the wife of who? Joseph. And Joseph was a carpenter. So her plans, can you imagine the plans she had? All right, I'm going to marry Joseph, and we're going to be carpenter, and we're going to carpenter's wife, we're going to have kids, and this is what's going to happen. Did the plans change? They changed dramatically. And I want you to think about it. Obviously the Lord chose her, and there's, humanly speaking, we can see some reasons why, but He changes it. He even tells them, okay, this is what He's going to do. This is going to be His name. How many of you would like to have had the reading and get to choose your child's name? His vocation. Anything. Which, by the way, we're told to train up a child the way he should go. There is a way that he should go, and how many of us are looking with the way that God wants him to go and not the way that I want him to go? There is a big difference. I want him to take over the family business. I want to do whatever it might be. It became obvious to me when I had the lawn service up doing it full time that Will was not inclined. He liked to do yard work, liked to help, but he was not inclined to want to do that full time. Came real out. That was not his giftedness. And if I was wanting to be fair to him, I needed to encourage him in where he was gifted. And which he did. He was more gifted in the way that Gene is. And when I look at literature, it's not good. When he looks at literature, he sees stuff. When he tells me, I can see it, but until he tells me, I don't see it. I'm just not gifted that way. But think about it. So here you have this change of plans, but how do you accept the change of plans when you think about it, when God does it? And it's interesting. Notice in verse 38 what it says. Notice in 37, she's wanting to know how it's possible. And notice in 37, nothing is impossible with God, as we often hear Don talk about. But notice in 38, Mary said, "Behold thy bondslave of the Lord, be it done to me according to your word." How many are willing to say, okay, this isn't what I had planned, this isn't the way I was, but if this is what you want for me, I'm your bondslave, I'll do this. And notice that she do it, she also then writes a great song in 46, praising the Lord, in which she quotes, it's amazing, she quotes 15 different Old Testament quotations. She knew her Bible. You think of the age that she is, how well she knew her Bible. You can see, humanly speaking, why God chose to put her in this, Jesus, into this home. But how many of us are planning ahead? Did she know she was going to need all these verses? We learn the Bible because we never know when we're going to need it or how we're going to need it. But it's interesting, God changed her plans. She welcomed those changes, and she lived according to those changes. But it did cost her. Did she have other children? Okay, she had at least 4 sons. We know their names, and had at least 2 daughters. According to Mark 6, verse 3, and John 7, verse 5, did they believe Jesus was the Messiah?
Not at first.
Okay, they didn't. What about the people of the city? Did they think that it was virgin birth? No. Because obviously it never happened before, afterward, or ever will again. And so you think about it, it cost her something. A change of plans, but she was willing to accept those changes. It's also interesting, on the cost, was she at the crucifixion? Yep. You think about it, she recognized Christ as her Messiah, but he's still her son, and he still saw it. And tremendous cost. But it's also interesting when you stop and think, why continue on? Why pursue through? Acts 1 and verse 14, which was less than 50 days after, because the Pentecost later. But notice in chapter 1, verse 14, it says they're meeting in the upper room along with Mary and who? The brothers. Christ met them, according to 1 Corinthians 15, met James on the road, and they had turned. Stay true to the course. You never know when they might turn. They were all adults by this time, but they recognized, and then they became leaders in the early church. So you think about it, God may change your plans. How well do we welcome those plans? Then how well do we work with those plans? And you never realize people are watching and the impact that you can have. And so you notice then, you press on, you accept the altered plans, and look what happens. God can really do great things. Let's think about the thing we have about mothers' do's and don'ts. We've looked at several of them here, and I'll just give you a couple of others. But one is that in Genesis 25 and verse 18, it makes the statement, Isaac loved who? Who did Isaac love?
Esau.
Esau, because he made the porridge and so on. And Rebekah loved partiality. Partiality, does it cause any problems in the home? Now, oftentimes people are going to accuse different ones of partiality, and there will be certain personality differences you're going to have. Ones you're closer to one because of personality. But needless to say, partiality is a don't. Do your very best to love them all. That can show at different times. We give you, and you can think about how you want to take it as a child, or how you want to take it. Growing up, obviously, with my parents were here, and there's 6 of us, and we didn't have much money. In fact, we were very poor. I look at it now. I didn't know it then. We always had food on the table and everything else. But all of us needed to have braces. The oldest three, we didn't get braces. But when we were out of the home, parents being in the same home, money's more freely, you keep paying what you're saying, the younger three were able to get braces. Is that partiality? No. They gave us everything they had. So I think it's important. You can look at it and say, well, that's not fair. No, they gave everything they had. There wasn't anything else they could do. But as time comes on, so you have to be fair when we look at things and recognize there wasn't any partiality. They gave everything they had. They just didn't have it. Another one, I think, what about, we already saw that in 1 Timothy when it talks about Hannah. What about a prayer warrior? How important is it for a mother to be a prayer warrior and a father? And by the way, how many of you have found the older you get, the greater prayer warrior you become? You can't just say, don't do this, because now they're on their own, right? And the only person that can make them change is a higher power, and it's not you. So you think about it, but how many of us are a prayer warrior? We saw that with Hannah. Also with Hannah, how many of us are a woman of our word, or a man of our word? It's important to recognize just how important it is. Because when you're a person of your word, they know that they can depend on you. If they say you're going to pray, you're going to pray. If you say you're going to do something, you do it. They can always depend on whoever they are. So think about the woman that you have. You think about it, Matthew 23, remember in verse 37 when Jesus made the statement when he talks about Jerusalem, I wish to gather you as a mother does what? Her chicks under her wing. You think about it, how protective and how well prepared is a mother chick and so on. We have it at the refinery, we have geese all over because of the water, and it's amazing. One of them was walking, and next thing you know, he got nailed in the back of the head. Got too close to that nest. And he might have been a 200-pound guy, but he was on the ground after that goose hit him in the back of the head. He made the statement, oh, everything's going to be all fine. She won't bother. You find out real quick. You get them up, you don't want to get too close to that nest. But think about protecting to protect. Why do they cover in a fire? The mother will die, but often the little ones will stay alive underneath. The protection is there. Good. We've always kidded it growing up, and even now we have Papa Bear and Mama Bear. That's these two. You can do anything to them, but don't mess with don't mess with their little cubs. I don't care how old their cubs are. You don't mess with them. And I think it's important. Gina and I were also in Canada and saw a grizzly bear with her two little cubs, and it was nice to see from a distance. But then all the photographers kept people stopping, getting out, and getting closer and closer and closer. And I just told Gina, I said, let's get in the car. It's time to leave. I really don't want to witness what happens when you get too close to one of those cubs. It's important to recognize the protection, but then the same thing is true. But there's a time when only God can protect. We can do things, but only God can protect. The prayer is important. It's also interesting, you think about it, did Jesus get on James and John's brother for praying for them to be on the right and the left? No. A desire for them to have importance. Now, he tells them how to get it is through service, and it wasn't for them to give it. But notice, I think it's important to desire what's best for your children, but realize the cost can be there too. And notice the cost. It cost both of those men dearly. They served the Lord and they did do it. Where they're going to be so far as whether right or left, we're never told. It's not. But needless to say, we desire our children's success. But how do you define success? I think it's an important question. How do you define success? So I think it's important. Is it the line or the dot, as we've often talked about? And I think it's important. The older we get, the more we recognize that eternal success, spiritual success, is a whole lot more important than the physical success you have on the deal. Obviously being there during difficult times, and then obviously teaching the Lord his ways. You have that, we saw in Proverbs 31, you have it in Proverbs 22, verse 6, to teach the ways. So I think it's interesting, what are we trying to teach them? So who else? Who else has something they want to say about their mom? Anybody?
Well, that's something about my mom, she never seemed to show favoritism. It was 5 of us kids, and, you know, that's it. We all seemed to think that she loved us the same. That's a gift.
Yes, it is. It's a gift and it's a choice. Who else? Yes.
Mom and Dad both were great prayer warriors. I can remember, and actually my first true memory of Mom and Dad doing evening devotions with us before we would go to bed. And we carried that through, you know, when we were teens, you know, even we were given a curfew, and that's when we would do our devotional, and Mom and Dad both would pray for all 4 of us. Then here a while back, you and I had chatted a little bit, was asked to pray. Boldly enough, we are a church that when someone asks for prayer, we pray.
Right.
Stood there on the phone, prayed, and heard nothing at the other end, and I thought, okay, either he's hung up or he's really listening. And he was listening and thanked me. He called me twice the second day and just thanked me. He said, I needed that. I needed you to help me get to God. Honey, you were already there. You just
It's important for all of it, I think. People have asked me, I never really said too much, but obviously you all know my mom and dad. I got to thinking today how to summarize my mom, and since I deal a lot with plants, some of you know what a product called preen is. Preen, P-R-E-E-N. Well, I'll change it to preen. And with regard to my mom, is that a prayer warrior? Both my parents are great prayer warriors, and it was great. They'd sit out on the front porch anytime any one of the 6 of us wanted to talk to my mom or dad. We'd meet them on the front porch. That way we could have a private conversation. And oftentimes with prayer. Also, I think about with R is you had she loved to read, and my mom and loved knowledge still to this day. She's always wanting to learn more and read more, and kind of instilled in all of us the reading. That was one of the great treats. She'd have a book she'd be reading, and she'd read a chapter every week. She always knew how to stop it right in the most interesting time. And it did a lot. Things out of encouragement. She's always been a great encourager. I don't care how old we are, she's always encouraging. And just her enthusiasm. She's always enthusiastic. You give her a gift or anything else, it may be just something little. She gets so excited, you think, man, it's just a potted plant. But she really shows enthusiasm. And then also, I think out of music, you already obviously know that they have a great love for music. And we always had music in the home and playing. None of us knew how could sing like they could. In fact, all 3 of us boys or kids have all told all of us, please don't sing that loud. But I'm just thankful for my mom and just what all they've done for us. Still 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 what all they've done